Well, it's lovely to be here with all of you, and I'm really excited to give you a small taste of what we learn in this degree at UCL. So my name's Erin O'Connor. I'm a lecturer in social anthropology in the department, and let me change sides. Sorry, my button's not working. So, uh, what do I do? So I'm a social anthropologist. I'll explain what that means in a moment. And I specialize in Central Asia. So this is a region, as you can see on the map, um, and in Asia. And my work is focused on Tajikistan in particular. So you can see Tajikistan here borders Afghanistan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, and China in particular. And it is, uh, as some of you might know, a former Soviet country. It is also a Muslim majority country, and they speak Persian, what we call Tajik, within Tajikistan. And the entire region of Central Asia has an incredibly complex and rich ancient history, which has always been a huge source of inspiration in my work. But besides this very rich history, uh, like most parts of the world, Central Asia, of course, has also witnessed and experienced many socio-political, geological, and climate-related crises and disasters. Just in the last 100 years or so, they've experienced large-scale famine. For instance, in the early Soviet period, Kazakhstan experienced an enormous um, famine. They've experienced major earthquakes. For example, in 1966, the capital of Uzbekistan, Tashkent, experienced a terrible earthquake that destroyed much of the city and left hundreds of thousands homeless. They are vulnerable to floods and droughts, landslides, avalanches, and they've unfortunately also seen some conflicts, such as the civil war that affected Tajikistan in the 1990s. And so these, of course, lead to the need for humanitarian responses on the ground. Uh, One of the aspects I'm most interested in my work, and is directly linked, of course, to this degree, is the relationship and the kind of intersection of migration and displacement of people with climate change and kinship. Now, if you're in this taster lecture for a degree in global humanitarian studies, you probably already have some sense of what the relationship would be between climate change and humanitarianism, or between displacement and migration of people and humanitarianism. But you might be wondering what the importance of kinship is in humanitarianism, why I would give you a lecture that also mentions kinship. So that's sort of what I'll focus a little bit more on towards the end of this lecture. But before we kind of dive in, I think it's important to come back to the name of this lecture, Understanding the Human in Humanitarianism. And as you might have guessed, my approach, and one of the approaches we emphasize and take in the department to understanding humanitarianism, is an anthropological one. So what is anthropology? Well, very, very simply, anthropologists are interested in what it means to be human in different parts of the world. And this involves qualitative research that allows us to begin to think about what it is that makes us similar, what it is humans all have in common, but also what makes us different. And you might want to, in shorthand, call this an exploration of similarity and difference, which is a huge theme in anthropology. And a very, very simple example of this, to give you a quick idea of what that might mean, is a common practice around the world is to get married. Marriage is a very important practice for many people around the world, but marriage looks very, very different in different places. It has a different value in society. It has a different meaning. It serves different purposes. There are different rules around marriage, who can marry who, whether marriages can end or not, for example, and what kinds of social obligations and responsibilities come with marriage. So this is a very classic example of something that many people around the world do, but they do them in very different ways, and perhaps even for different reasons and intentions. So, as I just mentioned a moment ago, the work of an anthropologist is long-term qualitative research, and we call this, generally speaking, participant observation. We participate in and observe people's lives, their everyday lives. And of course, we will often conduct interviews alongside this. And the purpose of this is to kind of begin to understand their perspective, their experience of life and the world, and what it means to be a person, to be human. Um, in order to do this, though, we don't look at people, a particular community or social group in isolation. We try to understand what it means to be human in a comparative sense. So we would want to compare ideas, practices, beliefs, and values of different people around the world to get to the heart of these issues of what it means to be a person, to be a human in the world. And in order to do that, it's really a big exercise for the researcher, the anthropologist, and you, the student, as we go through these questions in class. Because it challenges us to think, it basically challenges our existing assumptions about what it means to be human. When you look at other people's ways of life, other people's beliefs and values, you often end up thinking back at your own ones because that's the lens through which you see and understand and experience the world. And so the kind of shorthand for this would be self and other. When you're looking at others around you, you often are looking at them through yourself, through your own understanding and your own lens and your own body in the world. And that begins to complicate your understanding of self and other. And to perhaps hopefully also challenge and break down some of the ideas and assumptions that you have about yourself and your place in the world and what it means to be human. And this is what I think makes anthropology so powerful and an excellent kind of toolkit, addition to the toolkit of understanding and working within a humanitarian sector. Because anthropology, in the kind of shorthand form, we like to say, it makes the familiar strange and the strange familiar. So what I mean by this is that you might go and look at everyday things that happen in a context you are familiar with, in your home, in your city, in your university, in your group of friends, and you might start to question lots of things that you take for granted. Well, why do we do it this way? Why do we get offended at this? Why do we laugh at this? Why do we practice things the way we practice them? Um, and then and then it allows you to look at things that you're less familiar with, things that are strange in to you. And you begin to see them through new light and new perspective. And it starts to feel familiar. You start to understand the why behind things that feel different to you. And that is the work of anthropology. So you might be wondering now why all of this is useful or relevant to humanitarianism and to studying global humanitarian studies. Well, the word human is obviously at the core of the term humanitarianism. But have you ever wondered about what ideas and assumptions about being human are built into this term humanitarianism? So if we break down the kind of etymology very, very briefly and quickly of humanitarianism, you can see that essentially it's a system of belief and advocacy for human collectivity, for being humane, for being perhaps even benevolent. So it's this idea that we are here to promote shared common human dignity and benevolence and being humane with two other people. Now, that's a very compelling and powerful idea that a lot of people espouse and act on. But as an anthropologist, and this is what we would be doing in class as well, we always challenge our students and ourselves to think, well, there are a series of assumptions built into this idea of humanitarianism. One is that this idea of human collectivity, is there a single definition of being human? Do all humans around the world understand the meaning of being human in the same way? Do all humans have the same needs as one another? Do all people have the same idea around the world of what benevolence and humaneness are? And so if you're trying to help someone else, perhaps you need to think first and foremost about, well, what help looks like to them. What does a good life, a healthy, safe life look like to other people? It may not always be exactly the same as what you think it is because of the different ways in which people live around the world. So this is the challenge of being an anthropologist working in a humanitarian context. It's being able to believe in the work of humanitarianism, but do it in a critical manner, to think critically about the work that humanitarianism does. And that's a big part of what this degree focuses on. So if we think about all the things that humans have in common, at the most basic level, some of these things listed here might come to mind. You know, we're all born, at some point we all die. We have kinship ties. I'm going to come back to kinship, but kinship simply means your family, your next of kin. Reproduction, human reproduction, we're all born out of human reproduction, whether it's sexual or through technology today. We all have bodies. We all live in the environment around us, and we all have language, some kind of language. So these are kind of shared qualities and practices and things we all possess and have. They define a common experience of being human, you could say. And yet, all of these things listed here and many more besides vary quite drastically around the world because we have been socialized in different parts of the world, in different social communities and groups, to understand birth or death or kinship or the body, for example, in very different ways, because we have different values and norms and ideals about what the body does and what it's for, and what birth is and what death is. So, if you think about the experience of birth, if you think about ritual and what people do around the birth of a new person, that might vary quite dramatically around the world. In the UK, if you compare what birth looks like and means to people in the UK, it might be really different to, I don't know, somewhere in Peru or Korea or Canada. And so it's about helping us understand that there are a whole series of things we take for granted as humans. We don't think about the meaning behind the everyday things that happen in our lives. And the work of anthropology is being able to pull these out and think explicitly and articulate, well, what is the meaning behind some of these practices? And how does the way in which people think about these practices or beliefs or values affect their relationships with other people and their relationship to the world and what it means to be human? So let me give you a really tangible example, a very simple one. Blood. I think all humans have blood in their bodies, but it can mean very different things for different people. So in some contexts, blood is associated as something that's clean and kind of pure. In other contexts, it's really dirty. Sometimes blood is considered something to be very private, and other times blood is considered to be something public, that's publicly talked about or shown or seen. In some contexts, blood might be associated with something male, and in other contexts with something female. And of course, blood can also be seen as something safe because of perhaps its ideas of being pure and private. But other times it can be seen as a very dangerous substance. And I'm sure you're thinking of different examples of each of these as I'm going through them. And of course, it's not that it's one or the other. There are moments in which one person might see blood as something safe, and in other moments it's dangerous. So this is the work in part of what anthropology allows us to do. It allows us to start to unpack these ways in which we think about what it means to be human. So why is this again relevant to humanitarianism? Well, if you think about the work of humanitarianism, a lot of the ideas, again, that we think are common to being human are ideas of being safe, having dignity, going through poor health and good health, helping others and receiving help. But as you might have guessed by now, I'm going to tell you that in different parts of the world, even within one part of the world, we don't have to divide the world up into these kind of national bounded places. Even within a single country or city, different people can feel differently about what it means to be at risk, what vulnerability means, what safety means, what dignity means, what good health and bad health mean. And even ideas about how to help other people and why you would help other people and what it means to receive help. These are really bound up together with a whole series of other social and cultural dimensions of what it means to be human, and they really shape how people understand these concepts. And that's why it's really important to think anthropologically about them when we're exploring the possibility of doing humanitarian work to help other people. So with this in mind, let's kind of briefly think a minute about who we're actually helping when we do humanitarian work. Well, we're helping people, right? We're helping persons. Now, what does it actually mean to be a person in the world, though? Anthropologists talk about personhood, so the actual social experience of being a person in the world. And this raises a whole series of questions. Again, this is one of these things we take for granted, but I'll just list some of them here. Are we born with personhood, or is it something that we develop over the course of our lives? And does it develop in different ways around the world? What does it mean to be a person in a society, to be a member of a society? And how does the notion of the person or the individual, which is a culturally specific idea, being an individual is not necessarily a universal concept around the world. How does being a person vary culturally in different parts of the world? And with that in mind, what is the relationship between persons and society, between individual people and society at large? As Erikson, the anthropologist, has very nicely put it, the person is a social product, but society is at the same time created by acting persons. So this is a discussion around understanding the ways in which individual people can have agency, can have power to shape their lives and to shape the world around them, but also acknowledging the many ways in which society around us, the environment around us, the other people around us shape who we are as a person, as an individual person. So it's understanding this kind of relationship between individual and society. Now, this brings us to kinship, the final kind of bit of my taster lecture for you is, so we've talked about persons, what it means to be a person. And a lot of people, if you ask them, well, who are you? How do you tell me about yourself? They may tell you what they do for a living. They may tell you where they're from, but they may also tell you who they're related to. They may tell you they're married to someone. They may tell you they have children. And that is what the world of kinship is. Kinship can be defined and explained in lots of different ways, and there's a whole history of how anthropology has defined and explored the meaning of kinship, how kinship can be defined and how it plays out in day-to-day life. But, you know, it's about relationships, and those relationships can be built through descent, so who you descend from, who your ancestors are. And some people, but not all, but some people will trace their descent basically through bloodlines, who you are genetically and biologically related to through blood. There are other parts of the world where blood is not the substance people associate kinship ties with, but there are other substances people associate kinship-related ties with, their descent with. Marriage, your sexual alliance, you're marrying into kinship is also an enormous part of kinship studies. And on the whole, a very simple way in which I want you to think a moment about kinship is that who we are, who we're related to is decided by a whole series of norms and rules and beliefs and ideals. And those vary enormously around the world. But those norms, ideals, values, and rules really shape who we are related to and how. So there are rules about who you can marry and who you cannot, for example, and those will vary cross-culturally. So kinship is also really, really important now, if you think about beyond just what I've said. These norms, rules, ideals, beliefs have a fundamental impact on a whole series of major things that go on in our lives. For instance, they can shape ideas of belonging and identity. So they can shape our understanding of religion, ethnicity, politics, and even national identity and belonging. And those things, religion, politics, ethnicity, can really shape our understandings of kinship as well. Kinship, importantly, also really shapes the economies, the way in which we think about economic decisions in our lives. So if you think about, for example, this is just one mundane example, a lot of people have a last name that denotes a particular part of their descent, maybe their patrilineal descent, their father's last name. Some people have multiple last names, but historically, a lot of people's last name reflected who they were, who was economically responsible for them. So maybe your father's side of the family was economically responsible for you. And also who you might economically benefit from later, maybe you would inherit something from. Kinship also really shapes our legal rights. So who we can legally expect something from. For instance, if you're married to someone or you have a child with someone, that's all kinship, right? But there are legal obligations and expectations of people who have children together or who are married to one another in some parts of the world. And also, if you're underage, those kinship relations are legally recognized in different parts of the world, perhaps in different ways. And so it shapes who you are legally recognized as being the child of, or who is your guardian. And so if you think about, for instance, in a crisis, in a humanitarian setting, if tragically a child is orphaned, you need to look at legally what kinship is legally recognized as being and who should be responsible for taking care of a child. So this is why all of this is so fundamental to kinship, is so fundamental to understanding and thinking critically about humanitarianism. I just want to give you, perhaps to close, a few examples now of literally what I mean by how kinship can play out in humanitarian settings. So kinship fundamentally shapes the ways in which people experience and navigate times of crisis. Because the way people experience and perceive a crisis might be shaped by their ideas, as we've just discussed, about what is safety, what kinds of beliefs and values you have and want to uphold and protect in a moment of crisis. So when we look at the news today, you might think of different examples you've seen on the news, whether it's people facing a climate-related disaster or perhaps a conflict, where there are certain people who maybe are interviewed in the news saying that they don't want to leave their home or the land that they live on. And they refuse to, even if it's going to potentially threaten their life. Now, these are not the norm, like these are a small number of people. Most people do end up being forced to move. But this is an important example of how our relationship to land, to our home, to the material space and environment in which we live and are born in, for example, can really shape our understanding of who we are, what our place in the world is. When faced with a conflict, we see that actually the origins of conflict sometimes are very much driven by ideas of who belongs to what group and who the enemy is, who the other is. And those can sometimes be understood through kinship and ideas of who you're related to, who you descend from. If you look at conflict settings, marriage rates often increase in conflict settings because marriage is an important resource and strategy for securing the future of your family, the financial and physical safety and well-being of your family and your offspring. And as a simple example, in 2021, with the Taliban takeover of Afghanistan, we saw child marriage rates increase, as UNICEF reported. And it's important to understand the why behind these issues. And anthropologists do a lot of work trying to understand the relationship between kinship, marriage, economics, conflict, and safety. Sexual violence, unfortunately, is a big part of many conflicts. And again, sexual violence gets at the heart of kinship, of attacking the body, of attacking gendered bodies within the family. And to close, it's important to understand that I'm giving you examples of how kinship shapes people's experience of a crisis, but also we culturally and socially respond to crises, to humanitarian crises in culturally specific ways. So how people experience a traumatic event and whether they want to talk about a traumatic event and how they would talk about a traumatic event will be very culturally shaped and influenced. How people make sense of what's happened to them can sometimes be shaped by their religion, by their ideas of kinship, of who they are, and by their ideas of personhood, by their language. So there's so much work that anthropologists contribute to understanding the human in humanitarianism. And this is just a tiny slice and taste of that. So I hope it's kind of piqued your interest. And yeah, Dan and I and the rest of the team will be really happy to take any questions from you.